Bonjour, everybody. Je m'appelle Kaylee,
Je m'appelle Selena.
and we're here today to teach you about water and stormwater runoff, which is in honor of World Water Day, which was back in March earlier this year. So join us for a fun and engaging biology lesson.
So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, first, we're going to have a little introduction. And here we're going to talk about how water plays a key role in sustaining life. So basically, how does water help us, the plants, and the animals around us all survive? Next, we're going to be moving into the water cycle. And so you guys may or may not have learned this already, but the water cycle is basically how water will go through many different phases on Earth. Then we'll be talking a little bit about stormwater. So this is basically what happens to water after it rains. Like, where does it go? Then we'll be talking about action. So how you can take action to help preserve your watershed and planet and help keep your environment happy and healthy. And last, we're actually going to have an experiment. With the foldscopes that you guys now have, you can examine water from a local water source. And for the experiment, it will be on a different video, but I promise you it will be super fun.
Did you guys know that 66% or 2/3 of your body is made up of water? So the same water that you drink in a cup is what makes up the majority of your body inside. And this is really important because it helps us carry out many different functions. And we've listed a few of them here, but it's not limited to just these. But let's read off of some of the most important ones. So one thing water does is it helps us form saliva, which is important for our digestion. It helps us break down nutrients from the food and the water that we drink and eat. Water also helps us regulate our body temperature to make sure that we don't get too hot or too cold. And so maybe you've noticed this on a hot summer day when you're sweating a lot. That's a form of water regulating your body temperature. Water also helps us flush our body waste. So this is in the form of urine or also even in the form of sweat, as we talked about before. Water delivers oxygen to all the organs across your body, and it also forms most of these body organs. And last but not least, water allows your cells to grow and divide and survive.
So why is water so important to life? Apart from what Kaylee just told you about how our body uses water, there's also many other important uses for water. So, you can find water almost everywhere on Earth. You'll have lakes, there's oceans, there's polar ice caps, and there's even the rivers and ponds around us. So here's a few reasons why we say water is so important. Number one, we find water in all phases on Earth. So that means it can be either a solid, liquid, or a gas. And so this helps create different habitats on Earth. For example, if you think of the Arctic, there's a lot of ice there. Or maybe somewhere closer, like near the beach, where water is a liquid in the form of our ocean. And number two, water also helps us control temperatures. So the science behind it is a little bit complicated, but you can just know that water can regulate climates so that it's not too hot or too cold. And so animals, plants, and humans can survive. Number three, water is a universal solvent. So what does this mean? It means that water has certain molecules that make it dissolve easily so that it can help transfer nutrients and materials in organisms. And lastly, water is cohesive. So this is a bit of a complicated word, but basically it means that water molecules will stick together to form our oceans, lakes, rivers, and many other water sources that you can probably think of.
So we'd like to share a quick fun fact with you. Did you know that only 1% of Earth's fresh water is available for us to use? So I'd like you to think about that for a second. If we can only use 1% of this water, where do you think the other water on Earth is? So take a second to think about that. All right, so if you thought that water could be found in oceans or even frozen in glaciers or anything along those lines, you were correct. We can't drink water that's in the ocean because it's really salty, and we can't drink water in glaciers unless we melt it. So we can't have access to those different water sources. That's why we only have a very small amount of fresh water to use. So now let's learn about how this water is cycled through our planet and how we can preserve the very, very small amount that we have.
So next we'll be moving into the water cycle. So how does this water move through Earth?
So the water cycle is broken up into 4 main parts. The first step of the water cycle is called evaporation. Basically, the sun heats up any liquid water in the ocean, lakes, or rivers, and it turns it into steam. That's what happens when liquid water gets really hot. It turns from a liquid to a gas, and it rises invisibly, or you can't really see it as it rises into the air. The second step is called condensation. So now this steam water or water vapor in the air cools down and changes back into liquid. And you guys see this all the time in the form of clouds. Lastly, or second to last, water precipitates. So basically, when the clouds get really heavy and full with water, when they turn gray, the water falls back down into the earth in the form of rain, hail, sleet, or even snow when it's really cold. And now the final step is called collection. Water soaks into the ground after it comes down as precipitation, and it forms groundwater. And the remaining water that isn't stored as groundwater is called runoff.
Okay, so here's a little picture to help us better understand how the water cycle works. So I'm gonna start right here in this river you see. This can represent any local water source near you. For example, if you have a river next to your house or maybe a lake. So the water starts out here, right? But then the sun comes out and it's super sunny and it starts heating up that water. So this water is going to turn into vapor and it travels up into the sky here. And then if you look up, like try to look up and see if you can find a cloud in the sky and watch that cloud carefully. You'll see that the cloud is actually like moving very slowly, but it is moving. And so as the clouds move across regions of land, it's picking up that water that's coming up into the sky. And so the clouds kind of hold it there. And that's why when you see it's about to rain, the clouds are really sort of like gray or dark gray. And that's because the clouds have so much water, they feel like they can't hold it anymore. So then they let that water go, and that's how rain happens. So then the rain comes falling back down and the water comes down to the ground again. And since it's coming from the sky, it'll land on areas such as like the tops of hills, and it will slide down on the soil or any other type of ground that might be there. And then that's what we call runoff. And from there, it goes back into the streams or lakes or rivers. So why do you think this step is so important? This is the runoff, where after it rains, the process of the water traveling from wherever it lands back into the water source.
Yeah, so let's talk about Selena's question a little bit. So we'd like to introduce you to 2 main types of runoff. The first being stormwater runoff, which is any rain or a form of precipitation that flows over the land and does not soak into the ground. So any leftover water that's on the surface that needs to run back down to streams, lakes, the ocean, or other water sources. On the other hand, we have a second type of runoff, which is called dry weather runoff. And you're going to see this more in cities or urban areas because this is more in the form of excess irrigation water from sprinklers or drip systems that drain from properties during dry weather. So this is the dry weather runoff that you see in the canal here.
Okay, so next we're going to be talking about stormwater runoff. That's one of the types of runoff that Kaylee just mentioned. So this is when rainfall flows over the ground and specifically on surfaces such as roads, rooftops, or other surfaces that doesn't allow the water to soak into the ground. So did you know when rain falls on paved surfaces, such as the roads you see here, a lot more of the runoff is created compared to when rain falls over a forested area? And you might be wondering, well, why is that? If you think about it, on the road, you can't really make the water go inside the road, right? Because of the material that the road is made out of. But if you go look at a forested area or an area where there's a lot of dirt and soil, the ground just absorbs that water instead. And so rather than flowing across, it's flowing into the ground. And so these large volumes of water, when they do flow across the ground, they're carried into your local streams, lakes, wetlands, rivers, and this is what we call your local watershed. So right now you guys are in Makenge, right? So for you guys are actually in the Sankuru watershed.
Yeah, so even though the process that Selena described may sound very straightforward, there's actually a big problem that exists in stormwater runoff. So let's learn a little bit more about that. While the water is flowing across the surface, like Selena said, it can pick up harmful pollutants that are on the ground. And this can be trash, chemicals, dirt and soil sediments, even mining waste, or anything else that's on the surface. And these can flow with the water into streams, lakes, groundwater, and other sources in your watershed. And the large amount of stormwater from runoff can even cause floodings, which can damage your homes. And they can cause floodings in fields, they can erode stream channels, and even damage or destroy fish and wildlife habitats. And since less water soaks into the ground, you're going to see a lot of drinking water supplies not being replenished, or basically not being refilled when they're empty. And wetlands are also not going to be recharged. And this can lead to a lot of problems such as water shortages, or even making drought more prolonged or worse. And this can be bad for people and aquatic wildlife in the watershed ecosystems.
So did you know most stormwater runoff is actually not treated? And it is like that where you live in Congo, the stormwater goes untreated, meaning it flows directly into the oceans, bays, lakes, and rivers without being filtered. So what does this mean? All of that dirt, litter, contaminants, like for example, the ones you see in this photo here, they get carried by the runoff and go directly into your watershed ecosystem. So this is not a good thing. It causes a lot of problems. For example, it can kill marine life, such as fish. It can present health risk for swimmers or people who drink or use that water. And it also makes the water quality a lot worse. And that's super dangerous because, as you will learn in a later lesson, there's a lot of diseases carried in water that isn't good quality. And so many rivers near Kinshasa in the Western DRC, sort of close to where you are, it's contaminated with trace metals. And that's a very dangerous contaminant that we want to prevent?
So we'd like to ask you this question. Why should you care about the topics that we touched on in today's lesson? Well, let me share a statistic with you. Today, around 33 million people in rural areas of your country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, lack access to quality drinking water. So a lot of people have to deal with conditions like this and like this that you see on the pictures in our slide. So a lot of polluted stormwater runoff flows directly into your local watershed. So this is how it applies to your life. And this can cause threatening to local wildlife. It diminishes your water quality and makes the water less drinkable. It also wastes a lot of drinking water that you could use for yourself and for your family and for common daily tasks. And it makes swimming and fish consumption and even drinking water very unsafe for your health, like Selena was talking about on the previous slide. So we'd like to empower you and tell you that the future is in your hands. So you can take actions and take specific steps to preserve your local watershed ecosystem and your planet for future generations to enjoy.
So you might be wondering, I want to help. What can I do? So we have 3 ideas of steps you can take to help keep the water in your environment clean and healthy. So number 1 is clean streams. So we don't want to be dumping our waste into streams or roads because it all ends up in the water and contaminates it. As you can see in the picture, all of the trash and litter that was probably left on the ground or maybe even put into the water, this is where it all collects, and we don't want that. The second step you can do is you can grow a plant. So you might be wondering, how on earth are plants going to help us? Well, actually, if you plant native plants that have longer root systems, it reduces the amount of chemicals and water needed. And finally, for the third step, you can collect rain. So if you have a bucket or container, put that outside when it rains, and then you can collect that rainwater. So not only are you reducing the amount of runoff you have, but the water that you collect can also be reused.
Thank you so much, or merci, for joining us for this quick environmental and biology lesson. We hope you learned a little bit about stormwater runoff and how you can take actions to apply the principles we discussed to your own life. And if you do have any questions, we'd be more than happy to answer them. The best way will be if you write down your questions in your science notebook and share them with your teacher or NEMA, and we will type up our response or film our response and get back to you as fast as we can. But if not, we hope you stay safe and we'll see you for our next lesson. Bye.
Bye.